Hello everybody, I just wanted to share my thoughts on implant impressions. Broadly speaking, there are two types. They can either be taken at the level of the implant or the fixture, or the impressions can be taken at the level of the abutment. I tend to prefer abutment level impressions for a number of reasons. Reason one is that the emergence profile of the restorative component has been set by the manufacturer. And the manufacturer has designed said restorative components to function in a certain way, usually a fairly specific way, and this is usually an important factor with respect to long-term bone stability. The second factor is that they're generally more comfortable for patients because it doesn't have to travel so far subgingival. Patients tend to wince a bit when impressions are being taken at implant level. The third option is that if the theory on the creation of a long junction epithelium on the abutment is actually true in humans, then systems like Neodent that create the opportunity for this to happen is absolutely excellent. However, as with everything, there is a downside. And the downside is that for those of you who have taken both implant and abutment level impressions, you will note that the abutment level impressions don't have the same tactile feedback that confirm full seating of the component as happens with implant level impressions. However, in my view, this slight, shall we call it, inconvenience is worth tolerating in view of the advantages I described earlier on. The other fairly major advantage is that in the unlikely event that there's a fracture of the crown or bridge screw, it is usually fairly straightforward to just remove the abutment and replace it, and that is a very easy way of getting around the problem. If the screw component fractured inside the implant, then it's usually more complicated to retrieve. When taking impressions, when we actually come to make the restorations, the factors to think about are, number one, rigidity and dimensional stability of the impression materials. In my view, for those of us still working in the analog sphere, using a high quality polyvinyl siloxane or Impregum is the way to go. Intraoral scans clearly don't have these considerations but have other issues, and we'll talk about that in a future video. The second important factor to think about when taking impressions is possible movement between impression copings, and this is only really true when you're taking impressions of bridge work or splintered crowns and things like that. And this can happen occasionally when the materials are set, and I'll show you how I get around this. But what I essentially do is I splint the impression copings with a really rigid material before taking an impression over everything. The third factor to think about is the accuracy of the opposing impression, because we all like to ensure that not only do our restorations fit on the implants or on the teeth, but we also like to ensure that we don't require too much by the way of occlusal adjustment. And in general, the reason for this problem is that the accuracy of the material used to take the opposing arch has not been adequately considered. In my view, if you're not casting your arginates on the same day, which not all of us have the ability to do so, fortunately I do, we should be thinking about using the same high quality PVS or Impregum for taking an impression of the opposing arch if we are going to give the technician a fighting chance of creating a restoration that fits our needs of good fit and minimal occlusal adjustment. The last and probably most important factor is the stability of the casts during articulation. This, if it's a bounded saddle, is not usually an issue, but this tends to be an issue when restoring free end saddles. And I'm just going to show you two cases to illustrate my points. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that the impression copings are buried in the material, and this is an implant analog, so a dummy implant that I'm about to attach to the impression coping. And you can see that what you probably can't see much of right now is that I am not applying any pressure whatsoever to the material, just so that the impression coping doesn't move. And to achieve the final tightening, you hold onto the analog and the screwdriver, and that really minimizes the risk of any movement of the impression coping inside the impression material. And I'm just going to do this again so that you guys can see this clearly. So screwdriver goes into the guide pin. I've attached the analog to this particular implant, and I'm going to start tightening. And this is what I was ultimately talking about, that you don't get that same tactile feedback with abutment level impressions as you do with fixture level impressions, but in my view that inconvenience is insignificant compared to the advantages. So again, I'm holding on to the impression coping and tightening to ensure that it is adequately clamped onto the impression. So the analogs are now adequately tightened onto the impression copings, and you can see that there is no movement of the analog against the impression coping. And that's really, really important because when the technician then pours stone over this, it means that you're most likely to have an accurate model that doesn't really necessarily need a separate verification visit. So this particular patient had a provisional bridge, which we made because of the extensive sinus surgery that he required. And I wouldn't go into the details of that at this point in time, but that is the provisional in his mouth, and we're now ready to make the definitive. So one option we have, which was possible in this case, is to take an impression of the provision in the mouth, and that also gives the technician an idea of the shape that the patient has signed up to. I can then hand articulate the models. There's no question about the intercuspal position. There's no movement whatsoever. So the technician can scan both the upper and lower models, create a model, a working impression, and then cross-articulate virtually this new model with the lower model, and that will have the information of the provisional set, and that way we don't have to worry about the casts rocking during the mounting procedures. I will be covering these issues in more detail in the upcoming implant restorative course or on other occlusion courses throughout the year. But if you have any further questions and comments, just contact me by email or by social media. Have a great day.